Another way this feels connected is that if you think about it, incomprehension is not an inherent part of the object or being that is incomprehensible, but rather something the mind does. After the last video, which was rather personal and dark, I was searching for a palate cleanser, and what would be a better palate cleanser than science fiction horror? My starting point was the age-old question, why do we enjoy horror? And especially here, why do we enjoy cosmic horror? However, this turned much more personal and much more specific over the course of writing the script. It's always a bit a paradox, isn't it? Why do we deliberately seek out things we know will scare us, or even terrify and disturb us? And why do we, if it goes well, even enjoy doing so? This is especially a part of my personal relationship with the genre of horror, which is a bit complicated for me. It is difficult and depending of how I'm feeling at the moment, maybe even dangerous for me because I have rather severe mental illness, which leads to me being much more emotionally in the story. Don't get me wrong, unless when I have a really extreme episode, which I didn't have for 4 years or so at this point, I completely understand rationally that what I see or read is not reality. But one thing that is probably not as clear for people who aren't neurodivergent is that understanding something rationally and feeling the same thing are not always overlapping, and that if you feel something is dangerous or makes you angry or things like that, it doesn't actually matter that much if you rationally understand that this isn't something rooted in reality. But also because of the deep and scary and difficult to impossible to control emotions of being mentally ill, horror also reaches me particularly deeply and is able to explore how all of these things feel and stayed with me. It is able to go to levels that may be possible to reach with other genres, but are much more difficult and complicated to reach. The way I usually approach this genre is through science fiction, which is much more my go-to genre. So all of the examples I will use in this video are also science fiction. As with pretty much all of my video essays, well, if you can even call them that, this is an audio of me speaking overlaid with a speed paint. For this video I only had an old speed paint, the Lenin Lanier from Babylon 5, which isn't quite 100% fitting because Babylon 5 mostly is a political space opera, but it does have horror elements and I will talk about these later. Believe it or not, but I only very recently watched the first Alien movie, even despite having watched some of the sequels. I don't really think I need to summarize what exactly it is about, but I'll still do it. This movie follows the small crew of a commercial spaceship as they land on an alien planet after following a mysterious signal, which leads to one of them bringing an unknown alien parasite on the ship, which starts to grow rapidly and kills off the crew one by one. The main character is Alan Ripley, the third officer, who at the beginning seems rather quiet and unobtrusive, but later turns out to be the most level-headed of all of them. Then I will also discuss the 2018 Netflix adaptation of Annihilation, which I at first assumed was an adaptation of the Lovecraft story The Caller from Outer Space, but actually is an adaptation of the first book of the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer. In this expedition of 5 women scientists is sent into a mysterious area called the Shimmer to find out what exactly it is, why nobody comes back from being sent into this because they are not the first expedition, and how to stop it. This may sound like an odd choice after these 2 absolutely amazing, brilliant movies, but I truly think it's a really good movie too. Star Trek First Contact, which is the 8th of the Star Trek live-action movies and the second movie following the Star Trek The Next Generation crew around Captain Picard. The Star Trek The Next Generation crew had already in their TV series encountered the Borg, a species of cyborgs linked with a hive mind, searching to assimilate all species which could possibly enhance their own. And all of these encounters were quite horrifying. But for me, First Contact is definitely the scariest. Here, after a brief battle around Earth, the Borg travel back in time to stop first contact between the humans and the Vulcans from happening, which would also mean that Federation would never exist. One part of the crew is down on Earth trying to help the man who built the first warp ship, and this part of the plot is not particularly science fiction horror, but what happens back on the ship very much is. Because the Borg managed to find a way to come on board and now invade more and more of the ship while the crew desperately tries to fight back. This brings up Picard's own trauma with the Borg because he once was assimilated by them and could only be freed with a huge effort from the side of his crew. And they also weaponize Android Data's desire to become human against him, trying to get information from him and how to win. Babylon 5 is one of my favorite series of all time. It mostly follows several alien diplomats and the human military crew of the title-giving space station as they navigate the political tensions between all of their people. However, the science fiction horror part comes in the second season when several of the alien diplomats start to notice that an old enemy from their religious texts seems to be on the rise again. A large part of the fascination with science fiction is human curiosity and how we love to find out things that we didn't know previously. This is something you can see in all of these movies, or in Babylon 5's case, series. It is fascinating to see characters deal with something incomprehensible until it's no longer incomprehensible to them, and so also for us. The horror in this situation is created from these characters not knowing if these incomprehensible things are dangerous and in which ways they are dangerous, and most of all because they can't prepare for the threat, since all of this is unknown. So how could they possibly know which strategies and weapons would work against this, or what would only make it worse? In Alien, the crew is faced with an unknown planet, an unknown life form of which they don't know the skills of or even the level of danger. In Star Trek First Contact, humans and the rest of Federation has a limited knowledge of the Borg, but they are still very alien to the human conscious. This sadly is later eased up a bit in other Star Trek series, especially Star Trek Voyager, but in Star Trek The Next Generation and this movie they still feel not really like a species, but more like this light-years spanning organism which consists of all of these single drones as its cells. The feeling of being assimilated by them is described as being soul-shattering, overwhelming in how huge the conscious suddenly is and how it's overpowered by all the other consciousnesses, or more like parts of the hive mind. It is alien and it's so violating that Picard in one haunting scene even says that if they see someone getting assimilated, they should just kill them because that would be a better fate for them. Federation knows that the Borg have much higher technological capabilities than them, but they also don't really know what these capabilities are. In Annihilation, up until the husband of the main character, nobody ever comes back from inside the shimmer. So they don't know why it is there, what it is, because they can't even get clear instrumental readings from inside it. They don't know why it is expanding, if it will just continue to expand until the whole world is covered, or if it will stop at some point. And they also don't know how to stop it. The Narn and the Minbari, so two of the major alien players in Babylon 5, only have knowledge of the shadows and the Vorlons from their religious texts, and the other species don't even have that. They have some very loose diplomatic contact with the Vorlons, who, according to the Minbari, are the light and the good guys who fight back against the ancient evil of the shadows. But the Vorlons also don't really communicate with anybody else. The best you can get from them is some cryptic thing from someone in a spacesuit, which only makes sense afterwards. They don't know anything about their plans or their culture, and they don't even know how the Vorlons look outside of their spacesuits. And as for the shadows, they are mostly invisible. Also, both of them are advanced to the point of being incomprehensible. This works so well because our brains, from an evolutionary standpoint, are hardwired to overestimate ambiguous information. Cliché example, but it is better for the continuation of the genes of a human in Stone Age if they think some rustling in the bush is a saber-toothed tiger and it's just a bunny, than if this Stone Age human thinks the rustling is a bunny but it is a saber-toothed tiger and they end up getting killed. We tend to fill in the gaps, so if we have just a part of the information, it usually ends up being scarier than if we had all of it. This is where this horror technique of barely showing anything and relying on the reader's or viewer's imagination comes from. You can see this especially well in Alien, where the tension comes from not seeing the alien and so not knowing how big it is at this point and how dangerous it is and how it could kill the crew members. If I recall right, we only get one single clear shot of it near the end. In First Contact, it's not quite as obvious. It shows the Borg and it even shows the quite gory and body horror surgeries of how they get their cybernetic implants. However, it does leave the feeling of how it is to be assimilated up to the viewer's imagination. Depending on definition, this is averted or used in a rather creative way in Annihilation. Unlike most horror movies, this mostly takes place in broad daylight in these beautiful rainbow-colored parts inside the shimmer, because the shimmer works like this big prism. However, we see what it does to the environment and finally also to the memories and bodies of these women, but we don't really understand what is happening. It is just too bizarre and outside our normal experience. And as I already mentioned, in Babylon 5, we only openly see the Vorlons and the Shadows relatively late in the series. And before that, we mostly see them through the effects they have on the other species and single characters. In this context, incomprehension doesn't feel like just being in school and staring at some math problem and being annoyed because you have no idea how you could possibly finish this before the teacher comes back. It feels like something very primal and very deep and dark and dangerous. Which leads closer to the answer to the question of why we fear the incomprehensible and also why we seek out media that depicts it. As I described already in the beginning, this primal feeling of incomprehension shows the viewer how insignificant they are and makes them feel vulnerable through the immensity of space. In turn, this vulnerability then can open up emotions that are inaccessible otherwise. Most people don't think about the enormity of space and how insignificant they are in the cosmic timescale all the time because this wouldn't feel good, wouldn't it? You just think about some mundane stuff. But for this reason, if you really do want to go deep into this vastness, it's easier if you have some kind of way to go into it. And in this case, this way is cosmic horror. It's a perspective change. Through this, it can lead to challenging beliefs and even further understanding of things you wouldn't be able to understand with your normal viewpoint. For me, this change of perspective is definitely one of my favorite parts of science fiction, not just of science fiction horror, but also all the other kinds I watch and read. But the incomprehensible feels like a threat even before it clearly shows itself as a threat. In Alien, the characters and me as the viewer too were already uneasy about this alien planet with this strange alien ship and its strange organic architecture, even before one of them managed to open one of the alien eggs and have the facehugger latch onto him. In First Contact, their Enterprise crew already knows what the Borg are and is understandably terrified of them. But Lily Sloan, one of the first warp ship engineers from back on Earth, who managed to find her way onto the ship, does not know what they are, and she is still terrified of them as she first sees them. Even if in this scene they don't actually do anything to threaten her, as Borg tend to ignore everybody crossing their way as long as they don't want to assimilate them or threaten them in some way or interrupt their activity. In Annihilation, everybody at the Southern Reach research faculty considers the Shimmer as a threat despite them not actually knowing what's inside. Just that they can't explain why it's there and that it's expanding. I already shortly mentioned how humans are evolutionary hardwired to rather see something as a threat that might not be than not see something as a threat that definitely is one. But I think humans are also especially susceptible to being terrified by things they don't understand, because understanding things, pattern recognition, and also forming very large and complex social groups is basically what humans are specialized to do, what makes us stronger than other animals. Think about it. In terms of muscle power or even senses, humans are not actually that special and weaker than a lot of animals even. We became so adaptive and so good at altering all kinds of environments for our advantage because we are very good at perceiving patterns, thinking ahead, understanding how nature, other humans, and even mechanical stuff functions. We also have incredibly complex social structures that not just end with our family and maybe some small group of friends that then create a herd of some sort, but so many different ways someone can have a relationship to another human, to the point that now we have these countries that are bigger than anything any other animal creates in terms of social structure. I mean, they very much don't work perfectly, but they're still kind of work. We need comprehension to live, both of inanimate things and nature, and in terms of social structure between us, or in science fiction also us and aliens. That is why we are especially scared if we don't understand something. Now, I don't really have studies about this, so I just take this anecdotal evidence about how my bunnies reacted when they were confronted with something they couldn't understand. Sure, there were quite a few situations where they would become scared, like if they smell something on our clothes they didn't know, or there was a new friend close to their pen. But they also had quite a lot of situations where there was something that definitely was over their intelligence level and which even harmed them, and they didn't end up scared of it at all. For example, when one of my bunnies managed to bite through the cable for the heating and got a nosebleed because of the electrical shock, she was confused and possibly in pain about this, but she wasn't scared of cables for the heating after this. And yes, we bunny-proofed this much better after this. She wasn't even supposed to be there in the first place, but if you had bunnies, you know that they are very good at getting somewhere where they are not supposed to be. A side note that is not directly important for the topic of this video, but that was still important to mention for me. This tendency to be afraid of something we don't quite understand is also often detrimental to our modern society. I, as an autistic person, was the receiving end of this quite a lot of times, because Well, part of autism is that you have to consciously learn all these social things and expressions and body language everybody else just knows automatically. And for this reason, my expressions and body language and tone of voice quite often isn't quite how it should be, especially as I was younger and hadn't learned quite as much yet in how to behave like a normal person. I don't think they really thought of me as a threat, but they definitely thought I was weird and that abusing me for this is somehow justified, because this difference can only mean either a threat or at least something else that isn't positive, right? And I definitely think that a lot of bigotry stems from, or at least started with, some kind of small difference that isn't dangerous for anyone at all, but then someone is uneasy about it and tries to make this rational feeling sound rational in some way. We tend to fill in the gaps with our own biases, even if these biases aren't the actual truth or whatever we are observing and don't understand. So the best strategy to deal with something incomprehensible is observing it and collecting data without directly jumping to conclusions. I was surprised how in Alien most of the reasons why Ellen Ripley is the only crew member surviving at the end doesn't really stem that much from her being badass. And while it definitely does stem from her being able to stay calm under pressure, it's also not as much as I expected from how pop culture talks about her. She's introduced as someone who's an observer. She survives because she observes what is happening and also at the beginning cautions everybody to stand back and watch what will actually happen with the crew member with the facehugger, instead of panicking and letting him in and potentially endangering the entire ship, which is then what happens instead. She's cautious, and unlike some of the crew members who die at first, she also doesn't make assumptions about her own strength in relation to the strength of the alien. Sure, they were all scared of it and they know it was a threat, but they also assumed that it was still something they could win against if they have just enough weapons and use the architecture of the ship. It then killed them because actually it was much stronger than they had expected. I also want to mention Data's subplot in First Contact that doesn't quite fit into the cosmic horror formula, but still feels related, with how the Borg Queen basically tries to seduce Data with comprehending what it means to be a human and how it would truly feel like. It is a bit frustrating how the Borg Queen, as a face for the faceless, very alien Borg, kind of takes away how terrifying they are. But in this movie, she still works for me because she doesn't quite feel like a person yet, but some kind of device to break the huge alien hive mind of the Borg as a rule down to something and being that doesn't know this kind of hive mind can understand. Data as an android is not vulnerable to the usual assimilation techniques that are built for organic beings, but he can be overpowered, and this is what the Borg do. He then ends up tied up to a table and in a dialogue with the Borg Queen while his new emotion chip is activated, and he's absolutely terrified and doesn't really know how to deal with it because he didn't really experience emotions like this until very recently. Data's whole arc in Star Trek The Next Generation is that he desperately wants to be human, which mostly means the social aspect. He wants to understand human emotions, he wants to understand their culture, he wants to be able to emote and react like them. There's a reason Data is such an accidental icon for the autistic community. He's kind and curious and kind of innocent, but there is a certain tragic to his character because he will never truly be able to be human. And this is also something I related to so hard as a teenager as I first watched this. This is the point where the Borg Queen tries to convince him to join them, because thanks to the incredibly advanced technology of the Borg, she could actually make Data be human, or at least be much more biological than he is. She starts to give him human skin, and so also human sensations, and I didn't really pick this up as a teen, but there also is so much emotional manipulation in their interactions. In the end, it's a brutal show of Data's outsider status, and this is where it ties into cosmic horror again. All of this showing of the true insignificance of human existence in the greater scheme, and in particular the emotions and lives of the characters, and so also the viewer. It feels connected. Tangent end. Another way this feels connected is that, if you think about it, incomprehension is not an inherent part of the object or being that is incomprehensible, but rather something the mind does. Which then also means that different people with different experiences and ways of thinking, and maybe even mental illness and trauma, are more or less vulnerable to the psychological part of an incomprehensible threat. The Babylon 5 episode, Comes the Inquisitor, at the end of the second season, is a good example for this. Delenn, the ambassador of the Minbari, the oldest and most secretive of the younger races, a wise and kind and deeply spiritual woman who also doesn't really talk about her past or her plans and can be very ruthless, is questioned by an inquisitor of the Warlords if she's fit to lead the armies of the light in the upcoming battle against the shadows. Out of all the younger races, the Minbari have the closest relationship with the Warlords, so Delenn complies without fighting back. However, the interrogation isn't really about her skills at commanding a space battle or leading diplomatic relations to other nations. It's just a lot of questions about her identity. And turns out she can't answer any of them. Who are you? To which she answers with her name, but her name is not enough. She tries to explain with her affiliation and ideology, and all of this isn't enough. How can you truly define who you are? Is there anything constant enough to truly explain who someone is if you aren't allowed to use any connecting points on the outside? Before the interrogation started, she was ordered to take on bracelets around her wrists that now give her electric shocks every time she answers wrong, and she can't get a right answer no matter how hard she tries. It's really uncomfortable to watch. It feels even worse because at the end of the first season, Delenn, as part of a prophecy, and later turns out also kind of to pay back her own actions in the past, Delenn became half-human as a symbol for understanding between the different nations. However, this didn't actually end up with humans and Minbari understanding each other better after being in a bitter war 10 years before the plot started. It just made the humans ostracize her, but also her own people. She's very alone except for her loyal aide Lanier and some of the human military crew. She was already untethered in her identity and her place in the world before this interrogation. As the interrogator finally grants her a break, Lanier finds her lying on the floor, visibly broken, and tries to talk her out of continuing this. He holds her terrified what will happen if she continues to not be able to answer anything for the interrogator's wishes, but he doesn't actually try to stop it. This is where different vulnerability to this psychological untetheredness comes in. Lanier, like Delenn, also is a Minbari, and the Minbari culture is quite a bit more structured than human culture. They have these 3 different castes. They are very religious, especially the religious caste. which both Delenn and Lanier belong to. They value authority figures quite a lot, and they also don't really tend to stray away from old paths as much as humans do. Lanier in particular is a good 10 years younger than Delenn. This is the first time he's outside of his monastery, and he's quite naive because of this. He's very intelligent and can be surprisingly brave and badass if he has to, but he's also shy and a bit awkward, bad at social interactions, and this gets more and more clear over the course of the entire series. He's very insecure. Not just is he forced by his cultural expectations to obey everything Delenn orders him, even if he doesn't run to and suspects that it will end up with her being killed. He's also deeply in love with her. This is both incredibly tender with how devoted both of them are to each other and how deep their friendship is and how well they understand each other, especially in the second season, and develops in a miscommunicated clusterfuck that feels so real that I still can't be annoyed about it. Delenn openly romances John Sheridan, who is the captain of the space station, and pushes Lanier away, but also at the same time tries to keep him close and constantly touches his face in ways that are just a little bit too romantic to be completely platonic, and tells double-meaning things and doesn't clarify, and Lanier also never asks for clarification. He's too devoted and too insecure to actually leave her, and she knows that she's hurting him, but also struggling so hard with her place in the world and her past to do the right thing and send him away. Both of them struggle a lot with their own mind, with all these spiritual depths trapping them. I don't think they are intentionally written like this, but they both come across as being mentally ill. So of course getting the safe place in the universe ripped away and getting shown where they actually are and how unimportant and meaningless their lives are is something they are both very vulnerable to. Enter John Sheridan. Lanier ends up running to Sheridan, and unlike Lanier, Sheridan is very much able to try to do something. I have my issues with the romance between Sheridan and Delenn because of how extremely this ends up overshadowing Delenn's really fascinating multi-layered character. But in this episode it does something interesting. Sheridan does have some past traumas and will gain a lot more over the course of the series, but unlike Delenn, he never ends up being trapped in them. He has a very straightforward way of thinking, which makes him almost immune to these deep, spiritual, terrifying questions both the Warlords and the Shadows throw at him. His attempt to free Delenn ends with him being tied up and interrogated as well, and they only escape as they try to mutually sacrifice themselves for each other. But it's still interesting how he can act in these circumstances when neither Delenn nor Lanier can. It's even more visible in Annihilation. As the five women enter the Shimmer, it turns out that it doesn't just fracture light and other kind of electromagnetic waves and DNA of everything inside it, it also starts to fracture the very memories and personality of the women. It weaponizes their trauma against them. All of them have some kind of trauma that led to them being willing to endanger their lives on this mission in the first place. The first woman to die, the geologist, just is in the wrong place in the wrong time and gets her throat ripped out by some kind of vaguely bear-like abomination. But after that, the fates of the others are very much tied to their trauma. Anya, a paramedic and a recovering alcoholic who still has problems with impulse control and anger, starts panicking and tries to hold the others hostage, just as the bear abomination finds them again. It screams in the voice of the first woman who was killed by it. And now, as we are closer to it, it's also visible that part of its skull is a human skull morphed with a bear skull. It's genuinely one of the most terrifying creature designs I have seen. Since all of the women, except for Anya, are tied to the chairs, they can't really help her fast enough as it attacks her and kills her in a quite brutal and gory way. Then the protagonist, the biologist, who has a past in the military, manages to kill it, but obviously the 3 surviving women are absolutely disturbed. In the next morning, Lena has a talk with the physicist. This scene haunted me the most out of the entire movie. The movie itself describes the shimmer as a metaphor for cancer and also for self-destruction, with both works very well, but for me the metaphor that hits the hardest was seeing it as an allegory for mental illness. The strange ways the time works inside it, how everything is fractured and alien and strangely vivid but also terrifying. How it uses everyone's trauma against them. Up until this point, we had only seen Josie Radek as someone who understands her field quite well, but also is very soft-spoken, mostly in the background, easily terrified, and can't really deal well with all this horror, even lesser than everybody else. Anya was often seen protecting her. She always wears some kind of long-sleeved hoodie or shirt. In an earlier scene, the geologist talks with Lena and explains that she wears these shirts to hide the self-harm scars. They then shortly speculate about why she had done this, if it was because she was feeling too much or too little, and then end up talking about the trauma of all the other women in the expedition. In this scene, we see Josie with a white tank top, and she's oddly at peace. She talks about how the others want to understand the shimmer or fight it, but she actually doesn't want this. She wants to become part of it. She wants to give in. There are these strangely human-shaped bushes or flowers all around the house, and as Josie walks deeper into the garden, vines grow out of the scars on her arms. She walks around the corner and Lena tries to follow, but as she arrives, she can't find her anymore. There are several bushes who look like people, but it's completely impossible to tell which one was Josie or if she's even among them at all. What haunted me the most about this is how peaceful it looks. I made the mistake to watch this movie shortly before a major and very extreme depressive episode. And if you're this deep into mental illness, the thought about suicide feels kind of peaceful. You know that it wouldn't actually feel peaceful, but would still be better than suffering like this. You would finally stop feeling, finally be at peace. Giving into the mental illness, to the shimmer, seems like a way out that doesn't end in violence and pain like for all the others. This is the reason why when I recommend this movie, always advise people to not watch this if they currently have some kind of mental illness problem. Lena and Ventress, the leader of the expedition and the psychologist who has cancer, then part ways, but seem otherwise relatively fine. However, as they meet again at a lighthouse where whatever created the shimmer probably first landed on Earth, the shimmer finally catches up to Ventress and takes over her body in an explosion of light that kind of eats itself through her. In a way, I can't help but think at cancer. Lena then faces off against the shimmer, first in the form of a fractal, ever-moving, rainbow-colored alien shape, and then later a distorted form of herself. She ends up surviving because she's the only one who can reflect and differentiate herself from the shimmer, but even she, in the end, is shown to have carried parts of it with her to the outside. I like to understand this as an allegory for mental illness, also because it captures something I experienced myself quite well. Mental illness can be seen as making the world incomprehensible, and it also shows how much we need to understand everything around us for survival. Nothing outside of me had changed, but I wasn't able to think about it in a way that makes sense anymore, and so it all became either useless or dangerous. Sometimes at the beginning there was something strangely elevated and fascinating about how the view on the world changed. As I was a teen, I had these sensations of my consciousness expanding and not really feeling the border between me and everything else in the universe anymore, which looking back definitely were first signs of mental illness. It was philosophical and almost religious, but it was also deeply terrifying. With cosmic horror, we can marvel at the vastness of existence without being threatened to fall into all of the real-life horror that comes with getting the same feeling from mental illness. We can step back if it's too much. It is not just a perspective change. I even read other people writing that for them the lack of inherent meaning creates new opportunities and feels freeing, even if I personally never really experienced this. Ultimately, like pretty much all other forms of fiction, it's a form of catharsis at processing something in a safe environment. Just like the viewer opens up to new understanding, the heroes also gain a new understanding of the world at a cost. That's why it's such a mixed bag for me as a mentally ill person. It can show me possibilities to come out alive, but it can also remind me even more of the depth of confusion and smallness. It makes horror not just a tool of thrill, but also of perspective change and understanding, just like what I love about the rest of science fiction.